Thanks for tuning in to this message at C3 Los Angeles. We're so grateful that you're a part of our family. If you live in or near Los Angeles, we'd love to invite you to one of our physical locations. Go visit our website for more information, and we'll see you soon.
Mark chapter 5 and verse 21 says, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, Jesus, he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will live.' So Jesus went with him. Jesus went with him. And a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' Now immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.' Now while he, Jesus, was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, 'Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not be afraid, only believe.' And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and he saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, 'Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha cumi,' which is translated, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat." I want to talk to you today about relinquishing control while you wait. And you can write down the title of the message this morning. Let's call it, "When Jesus Takes the Lead." Father, we thank you for this word. Help me to give it to them the way that you gave it to me. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, Laura. We bless you. We honor you. So Jairus, as a ruler in the synagogue of his town, was a man of structure. He was responsible for all of the structural elements of the synagogue. He was responsible for the structure of the building itself and all of its contents. He organized and arranged the structure of the worship services, making sure all of the elements were covered and all of the speakers were appointed. It was a very important job, and it was a job for which you had to be chosen, had to be selected. And the qualifications to become a ruler in the synagogue were probably not unlike the kinds of qualifications that the Apostle Paul would later lay out in 1 Timothy to be a leader in the church, to be reverent, to be self-controlled, to be faith-filled, to be a person of perseverance, among other things. And Jairus, as somebody who possessed these attributes, was selected to be a ruler in the synagogue. Have you ever felt like God chose you for something because you had what God was looking for in order to get a particular thing done? Like, I know that every good and perfect gift from our Father is a result of his grace and not our works, but have you ever felt like you just earned it, even just like a little bit? Me too. And to be honest with you, there's some good and bad to that mentality. The good is that it calls your attention to your character. Because God doesn't indeed choose people based upon the heart, and the heart is the seat of our character. So to have a sense that God chose you for something because you have been diligent to watch over your heart, well, that's a good sense to have. The downside to that way of thinking, though, is that when the good thing that God picked you for ushers you into some difficult and painful aspects of life, you begin to wonder, had I been even better back there, would things be even easier up here? Like sometimes I think about life in terms of like bare minimum blessing. Like you ever convince yourself you're the third guy in the parable of the talents and only got the one when the others got the 2 and the 4, and you know you're supposed to be happy with your one, but you can't get over the fact that the others got 2 and 4, 2 and 5, I mean. Bare minimum blessing is what you convince yourself you have when the burdens that seem to have come with your blessing are stealing the lion's share of your focus. And if you think about it long enough and if you think about it hard enough, you can convince yourself that had you been better back there, then the blessings you have up here wouldn't be so bare minimum. Like if I'd had better character when I was single, maybe my marriage wouldn't be such a struggle. Or if I was a better student, maybe my job would have a few less burdens, a few less pain points to it. Maybe if I was a better father when the kids were younger, our relationship wouldn't have the strain that it now seems to have. And maybe there's some truth to some of that. I'm not somebody to abdicate our responsibility over the outcomes that we have to live with in life, but I just know that we are so good at convincing ourselves that life's greatest blessings are actually the bare minimum that God was willing to give us because we weren't good enough back there to justify something greater up here. We convince ourselves that we haven't earned, the better version of the blessing, the 2 talents or the 5 talents. But you know what I've come to figure out is that actually the trials in my life, the burdens in my life, they have more to do with what's next than they do with what's now. Like if you think about the current blessings that you are graced to steward in your life, they likely have something to do with a previous trial that you had to overcome. Which means that the trial you are currently facing is not indicative of a bare minimum blessing that you currently possess. The trial that you're facing is actually indicative of the greater degree of blessing that God has wanted to bring you into in the next stage of your life. You see, the truth is that God will bless your life, and at the same time, He will allow life to maintain its challenges. And some of those challenges are just the garden variety, and to be honest with you, they shouldn't rob us of our joy and our gratitude the way that we let them. But other challenges that God allows us to experience, they are quite extraordinary. And they are legitimately heavy. And those are the kinds of trials that we actually wish were linked to our performance, because if I could just do better, maybe I could alleviate the pressure of this burden. But if you look at Jairus' circumstance as an example, it would not matter how well he could perform as a ruler in the synagogue. It wasn't going to do anything as it regarded his daughter's health. Like he could strengthen the structures of the synagogue all he wanted to. It was not going to make his daughter healthy. The outcome of the trial was not dependent on how well he could strengthen the structures of his life. And it's a good picture for how when we are in need of a breakthrough and we start tampering with areas in our life that actually have nothing to do with where we need the breakthrough. And you will drive yourself crazy thinking that if you improve upon or replace something that is in your hand, thinking that it's going to impact a circumstance that is completely out of your hands. That's how we often go through our trials. I think if I can just improve X, surely it will impact Y. Like if I can get a new group of friends, maybe I'll finally start feeling accepted. Or if I can find the perfect church, maybe then I wouldn't be going through this crisis of faith or this crisis of identity. Now, I know if I was finally in control of my schedule completely, like if I was in charge, if I was a CEO, then I wouldn't be so stressed all the time. In being the ruler of the synagogue, the thing about Jairus is that he was responsible for the cornerstone of his community. The synagogue was the cornerstone for faith, family, education, which means that Jairus was responsible for holding up that which held up the village, that which held up the community. But what do you do when the structure which bears the weight of the village can't make an ounce of difference in the weight of your burden? Wow. What do you do when the structure that you are holding together with your life can't hold up the weight of your life? Do you get mad at your structure? Do you forsake the structures of your life? Do you try to add to them? Do you restructure? Do you start thinking about all the ways that you could have better prepared the structures of your life to be more prepared for your pain? You can beat yourself up all you want. It's not going to change your circumstance. You can tamper with the different areas of the structures of your life. It's not going to take your trial away. You see, the truth of the matter is maybe the structures of your life aren't as lacking as your current burden is making them appear to be. Maybe they're not actually failing you, your friends. your family, your church, your career path, your job, your education, your schedule. I'm not saying they're all perfect, obviously not. I'm just saying that you shouldn't try to strengthen the structures of your life for the sake of laying something upon them that they were never designed to carry. But I thought the people in my life were meant to help me with my burdens. Well, they are. But as a God-fearing, Jesus-following, mature adult, you have a responsibility to bring your people not just your burdens, but to bring people the promises of God in your burden. You see, if you bring me your burden alone, the best I can do is try to cheer you up and spend our time convincing you that God's still good. But if you bring me your burden alongside your predetermination that God is still good in it and God will be good through it, well, now we can spend our time agreeing about the blessed work that God is doing in your life through that trial. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 19, Jesus said, if two of you agree on earth about anything, it will be done for you by my Father who is in heaven. And you can wrestle with that promise all you want, but you're never going to experience any portion of what Jesus meant there until you start carrying around a confession in your mouth that your friends can actually agree with. You see, this is why a godly friend won't sit across a table from you and allow you to complain about your burden without first pointing you into the presence of God. It's not that they are expecting you to come back to them without the burden. It's just that they know you don't have anything that's worth agreeing with yet. And so the conversation will be fruitless. You see, some of you guys are so caught up, frustrated with the structures of your life, the structures of your friendship, because they can't bear the full weight of your struggles and the full weight of your burdens. But the truth of the matter is that there is only one friend who is actually supposed to bear the full weight of your burdens, and his name is Jesus. Every other friendship you have is placed in your life by God and designed to play a role where they come into agreement with and believe in the promise that God is going to bring through your life, even in the midst of your trial and your burden. So you got to start coming to the table of your friendships with something that's worth believing in. You got to start coming to the table with a promise that's worth agreeing with. And the only way you're going to get those promises is if you go to the promiser. Is if you spend time with the promiser. You see, this is what Jairus had realized when in verse 22, when Jesus lands on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, it says that there came a ruler of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. This is Jairus we're talking about. This is the man of structure, the man who had it all together and the man who held it all together. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. The dignified became undignified. The structured became unstructured, because Jairus realized what you and I must realize, that some of life's burdens are not an invitation for you to build up your structures. They are an invitation for you to be undone by his presence, to come before the feet of Jesus. Stop trying to control every element of your life and figuring it all out, but come into the presence of Jesus where you can receive a promise that will actually give you a healthy expectation upon the structures of your life. Because it's only when I make it a discipline to come into the presence of Jesus with my pain that I can receive the perspective that actually what I should be asking of you is not a remedy for my pain, but a reminder of God's promise should I continue to trust in him and persevere through my trial. Which I guess brings us to the subject of waiting. Because even though you learn the value of waiting with Jesus, does not change the fact that you are still waiting. You're just waiting with him. And absolutely there's some amazing benefit to that, as we'll talk about it in a moment. But it's also kind of challenging when you're waiting with Jesus, because the thing that I found out about Jesus is incredibly patient when it comes to my breakthrough. He will make you wait a long time to bring about the blessing that you really want, like uncomfortably long, frustratingly long, even fearfully long sometimes. And this, of course, is what Jairus would learn in the events that would unfold. When he came to Jesus and he fell at his feet and he told Jesus about his daughter's illness, it says in verse 24, so Jesus went with him. So Jesus went with him. And no doubt about it, when Jesus began following Jairus would have felt a great sense of peace in what was going to happen next, because now he has the great physician on the way toward his home. Now, having Jesus present with him did not make his daughter instantly healthy in that moment. It did not change the circumstance. And that's a really good picture of prayer, that when you and I come into the presence of Jesus and we're reminded that he's with us, and we bring him the genuine state of our worries and our needs, we receive some level of comfort and some level of peace by being in that place, by going into prayer and worship and gathering in a community. The prevailing presence of Jesus brings peace into our circumstance, even though our circumstance hasn't changed. And that's a really important part of your life's process, by the way. Because just as much as we need Jesus to do the miracle beyond us, we need Jesus to do the miracle within us. And the miracle within us is when we learn to trust him. The miracle within us is when we learn to receive from him things that are counter to our present experience. Things like peace, joy, and hope, when your experience says that you shouldn't have peace, joy, or hope. And when we have our eyes fixed on him, which, by the way, difficult circumstances are the best teacher to keep your eyes fixed on him. That's when we experience those miracles happening within us that we can carry on throughout the rest of our lives. But then life has a way of snapping you out of those things and back into the reality that there remains still an unchanged circumstance. And if your vision is oscillating between making sure Jesus is with you and looking back at your burden, which you're scared is going to bury you, you are not going to end up waiting in peace. You were going to wait in anxiety. And this is a really clear picture of Jairus' experience in this journey, because Jairus is pulling Jesus along towards the outcome that he wants, towards his home. And he's trying to make his way through the crowd that's surrounding Jesus, because there's always a crowd surrounding Jesus. And Jairus is trying to push his way through. And every other moment he would turn over his shoulder to make sure that he hadn't lost Jesus in the crowd. And it would have been a very slow journey. Jairus was waiting on the way. Like, I don't know, sometimes you feel like you're making progress one day, but then even making progress still feels like waiting. Just me? No, okay. So Jairus is turning around to make sure that Jesus is still with him. And we don't know how Jairus would have dealt with what happened next. The text doesn't say what Jairus was thinking or feeling, but we can imagine that it would have been pretty difficult, because as painstakingly slow as the journey already was, then the unimaginable happened. When they're on the way, it says that Jesus stopped. And the reason Jesus stopped is because a certain woman came crawling along the ground through the crowd. Like, you know this gospel was written by a man when it says a certain woman. She came crawling along the ground through the crowd. And she was whispering to herself, if I could just touch the hem of his robe, I would be made well. This woman is on a mission for her own breakthrough. And really, she wasn't trying to make Jairus' experience any more difficult. But that didn't change the fact that she did. Because while she is trying to get the breakthrough that she needs, Jairus is then forced to wait. And he has to wait, because the moment she touched the hem of Jesus' robe, Jesus' garment, it says that Jesus stopped and turned around and said, who touched my clothes? And if I'm Jairus, I'm like, your clothes, Jesus? We can worry about your outfit later. My daughter is dying. But no, Jesus just takes his sweet time waiting for the woman to identify herself. And then he proceeds to jump into a conversation with the woman, all while Jairus just has to keep waiting. And he has to wait. There's no point showing up to his home without Jesus. Not to mention, how's it going to look if you do? If anybody should be able to get Jesus into their home, it should be Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue. But now Jairus is learning that prestige and position are not what move the heart of God in your circumstance, which can be really difficult. It's easy to clap for when you're like, yeah, I never feel like I'm entitled. But when you know you feel like you're entitled, it can be really difficult when you feel like you are deserving of the breakthrough that you want God to bring in your life, especially when you end up looking at other people's experience who you consider less deserving than you, and you see them get the breakthrough and you start to think, Lord, they're not deserving of that. Their time on Instagram versus time in prayer ratio is way worse than mine. Lord, that guy still looks at porn. That girl gossips all the time, Lord. They are not deserving of the breakthrough they just got. It says when this woman touched Jesus' clothes, she was immediately healed. And if you're not guarding your heart and watching over your thoughts, you will begin to envy people who got an immediate healing, but really their immediate healing was preceded by the same process of waiting that you are going through. In fact, this woman had been suffering as long as Jairus' daughter had been alive. So if you're going to covet anything from a person like that, then covet their patience, covet their perseverance, covet their faith, covet their endurance, and celebrate the fact that yet again the gospel won out because a technically undeserving person received the unmerited favor of their Father. When you are waiting on a breakthrough from the Lord, there are 1,000 different things that will tell you to stop persevering. Don't let somebody else's victory be one of those things. You got to let somebody else's victory be what inspires you to keep going. Because for every instance that you can identify that should inspire you to keep going, there is another voice that is telling you the exact opposite. There is another voice that is telling you something similar to what the messengers from Jairus' household had to say when they showed up on the scene and they said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Why trouble the teacher? It's posed as a question. But it's not a question. It's advice. It's unsolicited advice. Unsolicited advice that is telling you to stop bothering with Jesus. That is telling you to quit. Unsolicited advice that is advising you to stop praying, to stop believing, to stop pressing into the presence of Jesus. And here's the thing about advice like that. Usually advice like that is not malicious. It's just misinformed. You see, it's always struck me as interesting that when these messengers show up from Jairus' home, the word that they use to describe Jesus is teacher. Maybe they call him teacher because they're being sarcastic. Jesus is wasting valuable time by teaching this woman about how and why she was healed. Maybe they call him teacher because that's just what people called Jesus. At the very least, what they call Jesus is very revealing of the depth of revelation they had about who Jesus was. And that's why they give the advice that they do. Because if he's teacher, why would you involve a teacher in something that requires a resurrection? Even if they knew of him as a healer and even if they thought of him as a miracle worker, I could still understand the advice that they give Jairus at this juncture. The girl is dead after all. The reality of the situation has eclipsed the depth of the revelation of who Jesus is, which is one of those things that will cause you to part ways with Jesus. Maybe not all together. Like some of you here, you consider yourself a Jesus follower and you're so in with Jesus, but if you were honest with yourself, there are areas of your life that you have stopped involving Jesus in because the reality of that situation has eclipsed your revelation of who Jesus is. And so you are listening to the voice that is saying, stop bothering. Why bother the teacher anymore? But bothering him is exactly what Jesus wants you to do. Falling at his feet is exactly where Jesus wants you to be. All he needs is your dependence. He doesn't need your strength. He doesn't need your abilities. He just needs you to be dependent upon him. You see, when you are in the midst of a hopeless circumstance, maybe what you need is not a better reality. Maybe what you need is a deeper revelation of the authority that Jesus has over your reality. Because it's the authority that Jesus has over your reality that allows him to turn around to Jairus in this moment and say something like, don't be afraid, only believe. Now, it's exactly what we would expect Jesus to say in a moment like this because we now have the gift of hindsight and retrospect. But if you are Jairus and you are hearing Jesus say to you, don't be afraid, only believe, you're thinking to yourself, what kind of strange command is that? Like, what is more final, what is more irreversible than death? And you want me to only believe? What does it even look like to only believe when you can do nothing? I think the fact that Jairus could do nothing was exactly Jesus' point. That's why he was saying only believe. Because up until this moment, Jairus had been believing and pulling Jesus along. Up until this moment, Jairus had been believing and taking charge. Up until this moment, Jairus had been believing and controlling. But now he was in a position where he could do what Jesus wanted him to do the entire time. He could only believe. And it makes sense because true belief is not bound by a schedule. Genuine belief is not circumstantial. Belief that is based upon the authority of God is not changed by what changed in your circumstance. So it makes sense that Jesus would say, I just want you to believe in this moment. And then what Jesus does next teaches us what he means by only believe. Because it says that Jesus permitted no one to follow him except for Peter, James, and John. And obviously included in that little group is Jairus as well, who is now following along with Jesus. So it's clear to me that what Jesus means when he says only believe is really follow me. It's a really important point, you understand, because when Jairus showed up at the feet of Jesus and poured out his situation to the Lord, what did it say in verse 24? Put verse 24 back up on the screen. It says, so Jesus went with him. In other words, for the first part of the journey, Jairus was the one out in front. Jairus was the one setting the pace. Jairus was determining the direction. Jairus was in charge, or so he thought, of how the journey was going to go. But all it took was one unforeseen variable, a woman with a different plan to his own, to make Jairus realize that this was not a storm that was going to bow to his will. Have you ever been there, like you knew you were stuck and you knew you were in a holding pattern, but somehow you still convinced yourself that you were going to exercise power and authority over the nature and the timeline of your waiting, and then the unforeseen variables hit and you are reminded that this is not a storm that is going to bow to your will? For Jairus, this was just a series of unfortunate events that were reminding him he didn't have control. When he first needed Jesus, Jesus was on the other side of the lake. And then the crowd made the trip painstakingly slow. And then the woman brought the journey to a grinding halt. And then the messengers show up and they say, Jairus, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher any further? And in the midst of his crippling and unspeakable pain, Jesus did something that Jairus in that moment probably recognized he should have let Jesus do the whole time. Jesus stood up and he took the lead, and Jairus began to follow. You see, Jesus is gracious and humble enough to go along with you when you are pulling him along to the outcome you desire. He's not going to be rushed by you. He's not going to be panicked like you, but he will follow along. But sooner or later, Jesus will allow your circumstance to teach you that if this is going to end in the miracle you need, it is going to require you to let Jesus take the lead. Jesus will let your circumstance teach you that you can either have him with you or you can be with him. The two are not the same. Don't get it confused. The first is about trying to drag the God of the universe towards the outcome, towards the miracle that you need, as though he didn't already know about your need, as though you weren't the reason that he came sailing across to your side of the lake. But the moment you go from trying to pull Jesus along to falling in step behind the King of all creation is the moment you start to experience the promise of his peace while you wait. But as long as you are out in front, looking over your shoulder every other moment to make sure Jesus is still with you, and then turning back to see your problem, you will not wait in peace. You will wait in anxiety. You got to stop trying to bring peace to your pain and start walking with the one who is peace in your pain.
And eventually, if you stick with Jesus, a miracle is going to happen. It might not be the miracle you originally wanted. It probably won't be on your timeline. But if you stay with Jesus, the miracle in motion, eventually something miraculous is going to happen. Come on, if you believe that he's a way maker, if you believe that he's a promise keeper, if you believe that he's the light in the darkness, then stand up on your feet, lift your hands high in the air, and let's sing it together that he is Waymaker.